Like most modern 3D programs, what you see while setting up your poser scenes is just a low quality preview of the results after rendering. The more realistic you want the image, the greater the gap between the preview and the final result. Poser's Firefly renderer produces better approximations of reality than the preview, but the Superfly renderer is better yet, as it attempts to simulate the real-world physics that determines the way your materials appear. From this point on, I will no longer be discussing Firefly. It's a legacy option, and while it can produce decent results, with mastery, the Superfly engine is better. However, even using Superfly, render times can sometimes be measured in terms of hours rather than minutes, especially if you have an older graphics card or CPU. With that in mind, here's a bunch of tips that can dramatically decrease render times, in some cases offering improvements of hundreds or even thousands of %. I'm going to start with the lesser speed improvements and broadly work towards those that will give you the most significant time savings at the end. Please note I have used simple figures and scenes so that I don't spend days rendering. I did 3 tests for each image and averaged them out. Any time differences will be greatly exaggerated the more complicated your scenes become. You should also bear in mind that these settings add up and in many cases multiply, so you may save orders of magnitude by applying multiple time-saving techniques. You should also note that some of these settings will be practical for final renders, while others will simply be for improving your preview speeds. This will be particularly important when it comes to previewing full-frame animation. On a note of caution, at no time did I hit the 12GB memory limitation of my graphics card. If you have a card with less memory, hitting that ceiling will likely slow renders down as well as creating unpredictable behaviour such as crashes. One reason, incidentally, why you should always save before you render. So, without any further delay, let's dive in. Use figure instances. Figures purchased from some sites must have the geometry stripped and provided as separate referenced OBJ files. This is because embedding geometry in every prop or character increases the memory overhead when loading multiple instances of the same prop. By the same token, you can often reduce render overhead by using the same figures and simply changing the textures. I commonly apply this by using the same t-shirt prop on different figures, then simply applying different logos or colours. Carefully choose texture resolution and format. High-resolution 4K textures may create fantastic detail for your close-up hero shots, or a lot of interference noise further away, but those high-resolution textures come at a shocking memory cost. A single 4K texture in PNG format requires 727 MB of memory, compared to just 27 MB for a 512K texture, or even 229 MB for a 4K in JPEG format. Now times that by the number of textures in your scene. Lower poly figures. Whether you increase model detail by using high-resolution models or subdivision, the results are exactly the same: slower renders. A character comprising 300,000 polygons may be needed for close-ups and so-called hero shots, but they are a massive waste of resources for figures that will be more than, say, 20 feet from the camera. It may be necessary to use the same high poly figures when you need to dress them in particular clothing, but perhaps you have some lower poly scene fillers that you can use as background props. You should also use subdivision judiciously. While you are setting up your scene, start by tuning your model's subdivision and displacement. Then, when you are happy, turn subdivision all the way back down to 0 while you build the rest of the scene, leaving it only until your final renders to restore subdivision to your preferred resolution. Less objects. This one's pretty straightforward. More objects equals more geometry to consider and more materials to process and more light interactions to calculate. There is a linear correlation between the number of objects in a scene and the time to render. More objects creates a busier, more plausible world, but if you are rendering a 100,000 frame animation, do you really need every single clump of grass, every piece of rubble, plus 20 fully and uniquely clothed figures? Don't use reflective materials if they are not needed. Reflections cost render power. Materials such as liquids, glass, eye surfaces and other shiny surfaces reflect the world around them, and mimicking that property adds realism. But do you really need that ring 10 feet away to accurately reflect the world around it? Increasing specularity will give nice highlights to add interest without such a high render cost. Fewer lights, less light. Poser renders by tracing rays of light bouncing around the scene. It will come as no surprise then to discover that adding more lights can significantly increase render time. The amount of light also makes a difference too, but it's not how you may have expected. In my timings, the lower the light intensity, the quicker the render. There is one cautionary fact that you may need to take into consideration, as less light can also mean more noise, and thus you may need to increase render quality to compensate. Do you need ambient lights? We know that more light slows rendering, but did you know that ambient lights can slow rendering by 55% for the first light, and then up to 25% more per additional light? Ambient light is when you activate a material's ambient value in the material room, so the object now emits its own light rather than merely reflecting light that falls upon it. It's great for flames, LEDs, illuminated displays, TVs, phones, etc. But if you're doing a street scene or a dungeon with lots of lamps or candles, all with ambient flames, you just dramatically increased your render times. Change the bucket size. The bucket size is the square root of the number of pixels that the program renders simultaneously. So a bucket size of 8 would mean 64 pixels are being rendered. That figure is then multiplied by the number of rendering threads. If you are using your CPU to render, the default of 64 will likely offer optimal performance. For GPU rendering, increasing the value can offer noticeable improvements, albeit at the requirement of more memory. On my Titan X with its 12GB of memory and 3072 CUDA cores, GPU processing units, I found the optimal performance was with a bucket size of 700. However, this value will be different according to your own graphics card. Use Intel denoise. This algorithm is the single greatest new feature in Poser 12. It enables you to render at a much lower quality, denoted by the number of pixel samples. Then the algorithm upgrades the quality significantly after render. Scenes that formerly took 30 to 60 minutes or more can now be rendered in 5 or less. You can turn this feature on in the render settings, then ensure Apply Post Effects to Render is activated. Open Post Effects and ensure the Apply Intel Denoise is checked. Do not activate motion blurring effects until final render. Motion blur is achieved when you render an individual frame of an animation with the motion blur setting activated. Motion blur can be activated in the render settings panel. Motion blur increases the greater the amount of movement from one frame to the next and takes longer to calculate as it does so. Limited displacement. Displacement is a process of using a 2D bitmap to change a model's surface geometry at render time. It requires a considerable amount of processing power, and in my tests increased render time by 61%. Actual values will change according to the size of the displaced surfaces within the scene. Do you actually need to use displacement, or will bump mapping be good enough? There is also a linear correlation between the duration of a render and the level of displacement, so it's better to set the displacement amount lower if you must use it at all. Simple textures matter. I was shocked by the massive difference procedural textures make. Even at the simplest level, texturing a plain sphere, I saw performance differences of 200 or 300% from one texture to another. It's unsurprising that lots of large 2 to 4K bitmaps may increase render time. After all, they all need to be loaded into memory first, and then there are more pixels to process. But you may be surprised by how much more complicated procedural textures can slow things down. Yes, a human skin texture with 30 nodes may look superb, but for a character in the distance, do you really need that level of realism? Reduce shadows. Shadows take time to calculate. The more objects they shadow on, the slower. If you are rendering figures as cutouts for posters, etc., simply making the ground invisible will knock a significant amount off your render time. Counterintuitively, it is also a fraction faster to render with the shadow mode set to the more physically accurate ray tracing, rather than depth mapped when rendering with Superfly. Turning shadows off entirely can also increase render speeds by a couple of %. When you're using lights purely as artificial fills and rim lights, do you even want them casting shadows, especially as this can cast unrealistic multi-shadows on the ground? careful of transparency. Materials such as glass and water use properties such as refraction and reflection in their calculation, leading to complex processor-intensive light interactions that can make the scenes render incredibly slowly. As with hair, turning transparent objects to invisible is one option to speed up test renders, but giving them a solid material or a simple transparency, in the material room turn transparency to 0.5 and plug no other nodes in, can also save time. Reduce render quality settings. This is a huge topic and is worthy of an entire video on its own because there are numerous tweaks to the render settings that you can make that will make a massive difference. Your choice of materials matters, but equally how you render them is also important. For instance, there's no point in setting a reflective bounce level of 32 when there are no objects in the scene to reflect. You can work through each of the settings, turning them down when not needed, or you could even save a minimum level preset for future use. Turn off branched path tracing in render settings. Branched path increases render times by a squared progression, so a value of 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 will increase render times by 1, 4, 9, 16 and 25 times. If you're just rendering a quick CPU preview, there's no need to activate this setting. If you're using your GPU to render, leave branched path off at all times. Reduce transparent layers and choose hair wisely. Hair often takes an inordinately large time to render. The better the hair looks, by and large, the slower the render. Strand-based hair is slow, especially if it is simulated in Poser, but transparency mapped hair or other objects can increase render times by orders of magnitude, taking a scene that might otherwise render in a few minutes up to hours, depending upon your hardware. This gets worse the more overlapping layers of transparency are present. If you're going to need to perform multiple test renders, either turn the render transparency level right down or set the hair to invisible until your final renders. Special cases. Here are 3 cases where the savings are impossible to quantify without knowing your hardware, and the hardware you are selecting or upgrading to. Select the correct render hardware in render settings. If you have a fantastic CPU but a so-so graphics card, it could be that the CPU is the better rendering option, yet you have set the renderer to use the GPU. If you have multiple GPUs, whether they are matched or not, Poser will now utilize them both. You'll have to do some test renders to see which offers the fastest performance. Don't forget to turn branched path tracing off for the GPU. And equally important, set the correct bucket size for your hardware. Buy a new CPU. Graphics cards are in appalling short supply at the moment, and prices are 2 or even 3 times higher than normal, making it a terrible time to buy unless you are loaded with money. However, despite the chip shortage, consumer CPUs are much more affordable, and Intel's 12th generation processors are easier to find. The i9 offers up to 10 cores, and the X series even goes up to 18. Better yet, this is the one area where you can go with AMD, and their Threadrippers currently offer up to 64 cores on a whopping 128 threads. And all that is not considering pro hardware such as the Xeon and the Threadripper Pro processor families. You'll almost certainly need to buy a new motherboard, memory and possibly a power supply to support your new CPU. Buying a pre-built system may be a better choice. Buy a new GPU. This is the option that will potentially make the most dramatic and noticeable improvement, not least because it multiplies every other improvement. If you have an older graphics card, upgrade it, having first made sure that your motherboard and power supply can support your new choice. There has never been a worse time to buy a graphics card, with a whole range of factors pushing prices through the sky. But if you can buy a 3000 series Nvidia card, say a 3070 or better, at RRP, the performance hike can be dramatic, depending upon the card you buy and what you had before. I must reiterate, only Nvidia cards will offer this improvement. Poser has tied its render performance to Nvidia's CUDA core architecture, which provides massively parallel processing. A super important note. Although many effects such as transparency, ambient lighting and displacement will all increase render times, the amount that they do so depends upon the size of the affected object within the scene. Thus, a transparency mapped hairstyle that might quadruple render time when drawing a portrait will barely affect times if that hairstyle is just a few dozen pixels within the frame because the figure is distant. Your speed improving choices need to be adjusted according to the prominence of figures within the image. I will also mention two things that feel as if they ought to add to render times but in fact do not. Neither the type of lighting, excluding ambient, nor adding depth of field blur affected render speeds below the margin of error, a few hundredths of a second. Allow me to just close with a quick recommendation for benchmarking your own tests. Go to the window menu and select log. This will open the log window. Now, whenever you run a render speed test, you'll get a precise rendering time. I suggest that you turn PostFX off in render settings because it adds time to every test but does not affect the measured result.